This is Josh from Breezy Bellows. This is the third video in the series How to Buy Your First Accordion. In the first video we saw a general introduction to the piano accordion, and in the second video we looked at what size accordion we have to buy, and we only focused on the length of the keyboard in the last video, but there's more to the size of an accordion than just the length of the keyboard. We also have other factors like number of keys that you want to go with, and the width of the keys, and also the number of bass buttons. When I wanted to buy my first accordion, the biggest confusion that I had was how many bass buttons should I go by. Although I could go on the internet and search for what range a 12 bass accordion has and how much range a 120 bass accordion has, but since I have never played the instrument, I didn't really know what I would need. For example, what is the difference between a 60 bass and a 72 bass accordion, and how do those 12 additional bass buttons matter, and do I actually need it? In this video we're going to be looking at the number of bass buttons and the options that they provide you in detail.
The options for accordion bass buttons range all the way from 12 bass to 120 basses. If you haven't played an accordion before and if you're looking for your first instrument, these options could be very confusing. A quick search for accordions on ebay.com shows a bunch of different options. The options that we see are 8, 12, 48, 60, 72, 80, 96, and 120. You can notice that although we have a bunch of different options, there are only a particular set of numbers that are provided as options. Why don't we have something like 50 or 55 or 75? Why do we only have these numbers? To get a good understanding of the system, let's start with a 72 bass accordion. If we get a good understanding of the 72 bass accordion, it's easier to understand every other option. We could work forwards or backwards from the 72 bass configuration, in which we'll either be taking a few buttons away or we'll be adding a few duplicate buttons to the 72 bass system to get our 96 and 120 bass configurations. This is a visualization of the 72 bass system. The 72 buttons can be looked at as 6 rows and 12 columns. The reason that we started with the 72 bass accordion is because it has 12 columns. The 12 columns map to the 12 notes, namely C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, and B. But unlike the keyboard side, where these notes are arranged in that exact same order, on the bass side, these notes are arranged in a different order. They are arranged in the order C sharp, G sharp, D sharp, A sharp, F, C, G, D, A, E, B, and F sharp. These are the exact same 12 notes but arranged in a different order. No note is repeated. This ordering is based on a concept called the circle of fifths. And there's a very good reason why the accordion buttons are arranged in this way. Let's not get into that right now and focus on what the 72 bass accordion offers us. We've seen what the 12 columns stand for. They stand for each note in an octave. Each of these 12 notes have 6 rows each. The top 2 rows play individual bass notes. The bottom 4 play chords. So these are single buttons that you can play to play a whole chord. The second row from the top is called the root note or the fundamental bass. If you look at the fundamental bass C that is right in the middle, we could see that the note above it on the top row plays a E. That is called a counterbass. And if you look at the 4 chords that are below the fundamental bass C, you could see that they are the major chord, the minor chord, the dominant 7th chord, and the diminished 7th chord. So below the C, we have the C major chord, the C minor chord, the C dominant 7th chord, and the C diminished 7th chord. And if I move to something like E, I have the E major chord, the E minor chord, the E dominant 7th chord, and the E diminished 7th chord. The reason that we started with a 72 bass accordion is because it has all of the 12 notes that are present in an octave and 4 different chords for each of these 12 notes. If you go with any configuration that is bigger than a 72 bass accordion, like a 96 bass or a 120 bass, you will still only have 6 rows, a fundamental bass, a counter bass, and the 4 chords, and the additional notes that you get on top of the 12 notes that you already have on the 72 bass are gonna be duplicate notes. These duplicate notes will provide you multiple positions in which you can play the same bass and the chords. Consider this example. If I want to play the F sharp major chord on a 72 bass accordion, I'm all the way to the extreme right. If the next chord I want to play is a C sharp major, my hand has to jump all the way across the buttons to the left extreme and play the D flat major, which is the same as the C sharp major. Although it is possible to play all the possible notes and the 4 chords corresponding to those notes, it is not very convenient to play all of the chord transitions in a 72 bass accordion. And if you are playing in the key of F sharp major, playing the F sharp and the C sharp major is something that you'd be encountering quite often. Having these duplicate buttons on a 96 bass and a 120 bass accordion provides us the option to play the same chords in different positions and makes transitions of chords much more easier than playing in a 72 bass accordion. We've looked at the options that add more buttons to the 72 bass configuration. Now let's go the other way and look at the options that provide fewer buttons than the 72 bass configuration. One step down from the 72 bass configuration is the 60 bass configuration. The 60 bass configuration still keeps all of the 12 notes from your octave, but it loses the 6th row, which has the diminished 7th chords. One step down from there is the 48 bass accordion. Unlike the 60 bass configuration, where we could play all of the 12 possible notes, but we won't be able to play the diminished 7th chord, in the 48 bass configuration, we'd be able to play all the 4 types of chords just like in a 72 bass accordion, but we won't be able to play all of the 12 possible notes. So on any accordion that is smaller than the 60 bass configuration, we will be losing range. Another step down from the 48 bass accordion is the 12 bass configuration. The 12 bass configuration is limited on both range and the type of chords that could be played. Unlike the 72 bass and the 48 bass configuration, the 12 bass configuration only has 2 rows as opposed to the 6 rows. The first row is the fundamental bass and the second row is the major chord. The range of the notes is cut by a half, where only 6 out of the 12 possible notes are available. We've looked at the impact of range and the number of chord options available in all of these different configurations. Now let's look at a few of these accordions and discuss other considerations that you need to think about before choosing how many bass buttons you need.
To begin with, we're going to look at a 12 bass accordion. So this is a kid-sized accordion that somebody can start off when they've never played the accordion before, and it is very limited with respect to the range that it provides on the bass side. So let's look at what we can do with a 12 bass accordion. To begin with, we need to find the C bass button. You could see that there are 2 rows of 6 buttons each. The top row is called the bass row or the fundamental bass row. The bottom row is the major chord. If I feel all of the bass buttons with my fingertips on the fundamental bass row, I could find that one of those buttons has like a small marking in it, whereas the other ones are actually perfectly rounded. So that is your C bass. And this is how a C bass sounds. You could verify this by matching it with the C on the treble side. So I'm not going to wear this accordion because the straps are adjusted to the size of my 7-year-old daughter, and I didn't want to mess with the settings. So pardon me if I look a little bit awkward playing this by holding it in my hand. As we mentioned before, the top row is for a fundamental bass and the bottom row is for a major chord. So we have C bass, and the button that's right below the C bass on the chord row is the C major chord. And this arrangement stays the same for all the positions, irrespective of whether we play the C bass or another button. Whatever button that we play on the fundamental bass row, the button below it is going to be the major chord that is rooted on that note. So a 12 bass accordion has 6 fundamental basses and 6 major chords that are rooted in those fundamental basses. So it goes from B flat, F, C, G, D, and A. Now let's look at whether a 12 bass accordion would be the right accordion for you to start with. So the advantages of a 12 bass accordion is that it's easy to find the fundamental bass and the chords. There are only 12 buttons, so it's fairly straightforward to find the C bass. And for the chords, the only options you have are for major chords. So you don't have to worry about which chords you're playing, or if you're playing like a minor instead of a major. There's less confusion and it's easy to start with. 12 bass accordions usually come with a shorter keyboard that is designed for kids. And fewer number of bass buttons means that the bass mechanism is much lighter than what you'd find in, say, a 60 bass, 72 bass, or a 120 bass accordion. If you're looking to get started with something that is super lightweight and you don't really want to worry about minor chords, seventh chords, this is the accordion to go with, but there are certain limitations to it. As mentioned before, we don't have buttons for minor chords, seventh chords, and diminished chords, which you'd get in a standard full-sized accordion, so you'll be missing out on those. So you only have 6 fundamental basses, so you're missing out on 6 more for you to be able to play any major chord. Having said that, you could still play most of beginner level songs. All the songs in book 1 of the Palmer Hughes accordion series could be played by just these 12 bass buttons. If you're unsure about how long you're going to be keeping up with your accordion lessons, this might be a good place to start, because 12 bass accordions are typically less expensive than accordions with like 60 basses or 120 basses. But also be aware that this accordion can only take you so far, and be prepared to upgrade to a bigger accordion if you're going with this option. I'd also recommend this for younger children. My daughter started her lessons when she was 6 years old, and she found it much easier to get started on a 12 bass accordion compared to another 24 bass accordion that she also tried out. That is because having fewer number of bass buttons makes it easier for the instructor to communicate to the student, and younger students don't have to worry about hitting the wrong buttons and can focus on identifying the notes and understanding the relationship between the buttons, and also focusing on their rhythms. And when they are ready, they could always move to something that is bigger. The next one we're going to be looking at is a standard full-size accordion which has 120 basses. And now you should be able to see how a 12 bass accordion is less confusing to begin with. The top 2 rows contain individual bass notes. The bottom 4 rows contain chords. The second row from the top is the fundamental bass, just like the one that you found on the top of a 12 bass accordion. But instead of having just 6 notes, it has 20 notes, some of which are repeated. And in addition to the fundamental C, there's also other keys that have markings in the 120 bass accordion. You'd have your A flat and E marked, and in most accordions the markings will be a little bit different from the fundamental C and the other 2 markings. And you can find your C bass right in the middle of the second row from the top. The row that is right above it is called a counterbass. A counterbass is a major third higher than the fundamental bass. And you'd be using a lot of counterbasses when you're playing bass harmonies. The row right below the fundamental bass row is a row full of major chord buttons. And the row right below that is full of minor chords. And the one below that is a dominant 7th. And the one below that is a diminished. Now let's see how these sound like. So I go to the second row from the top and scan for the marking right in the middle, and I found my C bass. And the row on top of that is a major third higher than the C, which is the E. And the major chord is located right below the fundamental C. And right below that we have the C minor. And right below that we have the C dominant 7th. And the last row is a C diminished. Just like how we have the C fundamental bass, a major third above it, and the counter bass, major, minor, dominant seventh, and diminished, we have the same for a total of 20 different notes. There are some repeated notes, and that is why a 120 bass accordion has different positions in which you could play the same notes and chords. That gives you added convenience for not having to jump long distances when you're playing keys that are far away from the fundamental bass C. And I've heard a lot of accordion players who think that 120 basses are not required and something like 96 basses would suffice. That is because there are only 12 different notes on the bass side of a 120 bass accordion, but there are 20 different positions in which you could play these 12 notes. Because of this duplication, some players find that 120 basses is more than what somebody would need. So the 96 bass configuration, which is a step down from the 120 bass, is very popular. That is because you still get all of the notes and you get to shave some weight off of the accordion. If that is the case, why would somebody want to play a 120 bass accordion? There are still advantages in having a 120 bass accordion. The 120 bass accordion gives you different options regarding playing positions. Now, that being said, most of what you could do in a 120 bass accordion could also be done in a 96 bass accordion without having to jump a lot. Hold the thought for a moment when we look at the 72 bass accordion and the 96 bass accordion. We could compare that with a 120 bass accordion and see what pros and cons each of these configurations have. This is a 72 bass accordion, and just like a 120 bass accordion, this has 6 rows. But instead of having 20 sets of 6 rows, this only has 12 sets of 6 rows, which gives you 72 buttons. And each of the 6 rows correspond to the same counter bass, fundamental bass, major, minor, dominant seventh, and diminished chords. So 72 basses is the minimum number of basses that you'll need to have an option to play every button and every chord that could be played on a 120 bass accordion. But there are certain limitations in playing a 72 bass accordion. For example, if I'm playing E and I want to play a chord in C sharp, I don't have that here. I run out of chords after the F sharp. So the only way to go from E to C sharp is to actually jump all across and play the D flat, which is the same as C sharp. But that's not a very elegant way to do it. So having more number of bass buttons than the bare minimum of 72 bass buttons helps you play things in different positions and not having to worry about jumping all across. Before we move on to the 96 bass accordion, let's also talk about the 60 bass configuration. So the 60 bass configuration is very similar to a 72 bass configuration, but it has 5 rows and 20 sets of the 5 rows instead of the 6 rows. The row that will be missing is your diminished chord. But since 72 bass accordions and 60 bass accordions are gonna be very comparable in weight, I don't really see why anybody would want to lose the option of playing diminished chords just for a trivial difference in weight. So I definitely prefer a 72 bass accordion over a 60 bass accordion. So the next step up from a 72 bass accordion is a 96 bass accordion. And unfortunately, I don't have one with me right now. It's a good middle ground between the 72 bass accordion and the 120 bass accordion. It has 4 more sets of these 6 rows, and which are distributed 2 on each extremes, which actually lets you play pretty much anything that you could play on a 120 bass. Honestly, I have not encountered like any particular song that could be played on a 120 bass but not on a 96 bass, but there might be something that exists. So the additional advantages that you might be getting by stepping up from a 96 bass accordion to a 120 bass accordion is not as significant as what you'd lose out if you step down from a 96 bass accordion to a 72 bass accordion. I don't want to discourage anybody from buying a 72 bass accordion. It's very popular even among professional level players that like strolling and playing. The reduced weight makes it easy to carry around and wear it and walk around when you're playing. And it's also very popular among intermediate level players. But before you buy a 72 bass accordion, be aware of all of the functionality that you'll be missing out compared to a 96 bass or a 120 bass. And another interesting consideration about a 120 bass versus a 96 bass is that the 96 bass configuration is something that only became popular recently. So if you are planning to buy a pre-owned accordion from like the golden age of accordions from the 1950s to 1970s, it might be very hard to find something that is 96 bass, and most of what you'd find would be full-size 120 bass accordions. And we do have more options between the 12 bass and the 72 bass configuration. We have 24 basses, 48 basses, and we also have the 60 basses that we previously discussed about. So all of those are going to compromise on range. In addition to losing the convenience of not having to jump around, in a 96 or 120 bass accordion, when we go smaller than a 72 bass accordion, we also lose functionality. If we go for a 60 bass accordion, we lose the diminished chord roll, and anything lower than that actually misses out on notes because we have 12 distinct notes on the bass side, and if you don't have 12 sets, you'll be missing out on some of those notes. So a 48 bass accordion would not be able to play all of the possible notes and the chords. Functionality is not the only consideration. You might also want to optimize for weight, and if you're only playing beginner to intermediate level songs in which you don't really need to play those notes, a 48 bass is perfectly fine. But if you plan to take accordion lessons for long term, be aware that you might have to upgrade from something like a 12 bass or a 48 bass to something that is bigger, like a 72 bass, a 96, or a 120 bass. We'll have a quick recap of the advantages and disadvantages of the different options we have for bass buttons. A 12 bass accordion is easier for kids, lightweight, and is less confusing for beginners to start learning. But the limitations of a 12 bass is that you'd only be able to play beginner level songs and you'll have to upgrade very soon. A 48 bass accordion is a good step up from the 12 bass accordion. It's a little bit heavier, but it's still very light. It's preferable if you still want a light accordion, but want to play some minor chords and dominant seventh chords and diminished chords in addition to only playing the major chords. Both 60 and 72 bass accordions have 12 positions with 12 different notes, which covers all of the 12 notes that are required to play all basses and chords, except for the diminished chords that will be missing on the 60 bass accordion. This is the lightest option that you could choose for if you still want to play all the possible notes and chords, but it doesn't offer as much flexibility as a 96 or 120 bass accordion, and you might have to jump around a lot when you play those chords. A 96 bass accordion is a step up from the 72 bass accordion. It lets you play practically everything that you might play with a 120 bass accordion. The only limitation is that it's not as widely available in the pre-owned inventory as a 120 bass button. The 120 bass accordion is your standard full-size configuration, and you'd be able to do everything that you want to do with an accordion. And there are also some other configurations like a 140 bass and like a 24 bass. I'm not gonna focus on those because those are not that popular, and it might not be something that you might want if you're a beginner. I'd rather upgrade from a 12 bass to a 48 bass than a 24 bass. And a 140 bass accordion is a novelty. It has a 7th row on top of the counter bass row, which lets you play one more row of solo notes, but it's not as common as a 120 bass accordion. I hope this video was useful in clearing up any confusions you might have had regarding the choices for the number of bass buttons. If you have any more questions, feel free to leave a comment, and don't forget to check out other videos in the series. At the end of the series, we'll also be looking at how to evaluate pre-owned accordions that you might want to buy on Craigslist and eBay. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel to get more updates on buying your first accordion and also to watch some of my performance videos. Thank you.